In a time of massive corruption, of tyrants and of despicable politicians, I still contend that Dan Andrews, the leader of the state of Victoria in Australia and Melbourne's Dan Andrews, is one of the worst despots that there are. If there was ever a tyrant that it would be my priority to remove, it would be him. He has just effectively cancelled the 2026 Commonwealth Games. And what I want to do is show you just how despicable and how snake-like this tyrant is. And what I want to show you first off is Dan Andrews when he was so proud of his team. This was before the election. He wanted to show off that he had managed to get the Commonwealth Games. He had managed to secure the Commonwealth Games for Victoria. He was the one that was going to make the state of Victoria a great state, a centre of sporting excellence. And it was through his blood, sweat and tears that he'd been able to kind of pry the Commonwealth Games away from anyone else and bring it to Australia. Listen to him before the election bragging about how marvellous he is.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Dame Louise. It was a great privilege for Governor Dessau, myself, Ben Houston and Craig Phillips to go to Birmingham last month to present our vision for the regional Commonwealth Games to the board of the Federation. And we were put through our paces. The Federation board wanted to know about that vision, about whether we could deliver, about what sports we want to include and how that relates to those parts of the Federation and their own interests and the sports in which they're strong.
Very good. Thanks very much for being here this morning. Last year, when the Commonwealth Games authorities approached us, needed someone to step in to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games, as a state, we were happy to help out.
So on Tuesday morning, this morning, he came out and said, we're not having the Commonwealth Games. It's over. We're cancelling the contract. We're not doing it. And the reasons he gave were because of a budget that had gone from 2.what billion to 6 or 7 billion. He's just kind of clutching at big figures. The budget's gone crazy. There's no way we can afford it. We simply can't do this. He said that he'd had productive meetings with London overnight, that those meetings had been amicable and that they were working a way through how he could get out of the contract to host the Olympic Games. He comes out and says all of this and adds for good measure, it wasn't even a hard decision. I want you to take a listen to Dan Andrews, what is today, so Tuesday morning Australia time, coming out and just sort of blasé announcing there won't be a Commonwealth Games here, we're not hosting, we're getting out of the contract, and frankly the costs are ridiculous. Take a listen to him here.
What's become clear is that the cost of hosting these games in 2026 is not the $2.6 billion which was budgeted and allocated and is sitting, vast majority of which has not been spent. It's not $2.6 billion, it is in fact at least $6 billion and could be as high as $7 billion. And I cannot stand here and say to you that I have any confidence that that even $7 billion number would appropriately and adequately fund these games. $6 to $7 billion is well and truly too much for a 12-day sporting event. I will not take money out of hospitals and schools in order to fund an event that is 3 times the cost as estimated and budgeted for last year. We have informed Commonwealth Games authorities of our decision to seek to terminate the contract. What we are going to do, instead of proceeding with games that would cost $6 to $7 billion, we will not have the games, and we will instead, today we're announcing a regional package of over $2 billion, and there are a number of features to that. First and foremost, each and every one of the permanent sporting facilities that were to be legacy benefits from the games will be built, and the Deputy Premier will speak to that in just a moment. There is a very substantial regional tourism fund. There will be a substantial package of support for community-based sport, and perhaps most importantly, there will be a $1 billion boost for social and affordable housing right across regional Victoria, not just in those hub cities, but there will be at least 1,300 new homes constructed across regional Victoria. And look, I've made a lot of difficult calls, a lot of very difficult decisions in this job. This is not one of them.
So please remember that as part of that, he said that he had amicable and productive meetings with London overnight, and that they had come to an agreement together. So how about now, putting Dan Andrews well to one side, we listen to what the Commonwealth Games exec actually has to say? How about we take a listen to their response, where they feel that they've been completely blindsided, they weren't given any warning whatsoever, and they weren't offered any solutions to the problem that they now have, which is that the Commonwealth Games in 2026 currently doesn't have a home and doesn't exist. Listen to what the exec have actually had to say about Dan Andrews' decision overnight.
Is a comprehensive letdown for the athletes, the excited host communities, First Nations Australian who are going to be at the heart of the Games, and the millions of fans that would have embraced the 6th home Games here in Australia. The multi-city model for delivering Victoria 2026 was an approach proposed by the Victorian Government in accordance with the strategic roadmap of the Commonwealth Games Federation, or the CGF. It was pitched to the CGF after Commonwealth Games Australia had sought interest to host the Games from several states. They did not step in as the host at the last minute, as indicated by the Premier earlier today.
Last year, when the Commonwealth Games authorities approached us, needed someone to step in to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games as a state, we were happy to help out.
The detailed budgetary implications announced today had not been cited or discussed with the CGF or CGA ahead of being notified of the government's decision earlier today. The stated cost overruns, in our opinion, are a gross exaggeration and not reflective of the operational costs presented to the Victorian 2026 Organising Committee Board as recently as June this year. I'm a member of that Organising Committee Board. Beyond this, the Victorian Government wilfully ignored recommendations to move events to purpose-built stadia in Melbourne and, in fact, remain wedded to proceeding with expensive temporary venues in regional Victoria. CGA welcomed the opportunity to review the financial analysis prepared independently of those who have been involved at the coalface of planning and delivery. We thank the dedicated staff at the Organising Committee and the Office of Commonwealth Games for their efforts, acknowledging that today will probably be one of the toughest days for them as they work so hard on delivering the Games. The Victorian Government, however, has jeopardised Melbourne and Victoria's standing as a sporting capital of the world. Thank you.
The Victorian Government lied to you?
Well, not sure at this stage. Certainly the Victorian Government has not presented us with the details that we would need to have an analysis. We were notified the very first instance this morning by them at around 8 o'clock when I took a phone call. So we've had no detail provided to us by the government.
So there they specifically call out that he won the Games because he was bragging about this multi-city model that he was going to bring in. They call out the fact that Dan Andrews and Victoria did not step in at the last minute. And if you refer to that pre-election video, they pitched for this and they won it because of this multi-city event that they were going to host. He calls out that at no point did they flag the issues with the budget, and he says as recently as June there were still not any issues with the budget. So this budget kind of inflation has suddenly come into play when Dan Andrews decides, like the tyrant that he is, that Victoria isn't going to host and they aren't going to have the Olympic Games, and sod the rest of you. He also talks about the gross exaggeration. So he is specifically saying Dan Andrews has grossly exaggerated the numbers in order to support himself. And you see how Dan Andrews starts talking about schools and hospitals because he wants the people of Melbourne to applaud him, of the people of Victoria to say, oh, well done, Dan, you made the right decision because maybe I'll get better access to a hospital. And they call out Dan Andrews for willfully ignoring their recommendations. So they basically said, why don't you just use the venues you've already got and make them a bit better instead of trying to spend huge amounts of money on new premises, new buildings. And he ignored all of that, and he didn't give them any warning, and he hasn't offered any sense of what might be a solution now that he's screwed everybody. And finally, as they make the point, he has totally put Melbourne, Victoria as being, you know, the bottom of the barrel, that don't care about sport. They don't care about young people in sport. And most of all, and the thing that doesn't get mentioned in any of this, is the athletes.
And look, I've made a lot of difficult calls, a lot of very difficult decisions in this job. This is not one of them.
Maybe athletes who don't have funding, who don't have sponsorship, who maybe could afford to get to the Commonwealth Games this time because it was going to be close to them or near them, or they could make it and this was going to be their everything. This is what they're training for. And just like that, this monster comes out and says, "No, it's off." And it wasn't even a hard decision. That is Dan Andrews, and how the people of Victoria have not sought to remove this tyrant from power after the way he crucified humanity in Australia during lockdowns is beyond me. But know this, Dan Andrews is a serpent, and you cannot believe a single slithering word that comes out of the excuse that he has for a mouth.
And look, I've made a lot of difficult calls, a lot of very difficult decisions in this job. This is not one of them.